From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with President Clinton's latest assessment of the new world order. Mr. Clinton was here in New York today, the 10th U.S. president to address the United Nations General Assembly since the UN was founded. It is an important time, sometimes a pivotal one, for an American leader to tell the rest of the UN's member nations what the U.S. is prepared to do for peace. And the answer this year from Mr. Clinton is less. Here's ABC's Britt Hume.
In his first speech before an institution on which his foreign policy has placed much reliance, the president reaffirmed his commitment to the UN's peacekeeping mission. But if you listen carefully, you could hear the distinct sound of second thoughts.
Today, there is wide recognition that the UN peacekeeping ability has not kept pace with the rising responsibilities and challenges.
That from a man who once seemed to have almost unlimited confidence in the UN. Mr. Clinton noted that more than 80,000 UN peacekeepers are now engaged in 17 different operations, and said the UN needs to establish a real peacekeeping headquarters with proper intelligence and global communications, things he said it now lacks.
Until recently, if a peacekeeping commander called in from across the globe when it was night time here in New York, there was no one in the peacekeeping office even to answer the call. When lives are on the line, we cannot let the reach of the UN exceed its grasp.
The president also said the UN must examine carefully each request for its forces using 4 standards. There must be a real threat to peace. The UN mission must have clear objectives. There must be a clear end in sight, and there must be clear knowledge of the cost.
The United Nations simply cannot become engaged in every one of the world's conflicts. If the American people are to say yes to UN peacekeeping, the United Nations must know when to say no.
A senior administration official was asked if the ongoing UN mission in Somalia would have met those 4 standards Mr. Clinton set out today. He didn't answer directly, but he did say the administration had Somalia in mind when it crafted the 4 standards. You try to learn, he said, from everything you do. Britt Hume, ABC News, New York.
The United Nations has been in the peacekeeping business since its first attempt to bring Arabs and Israelis together in the mid-1940s. Walk around UN headquarters today and you'll hear a lot of the old hands saying the UN cannot handle everything on its plate. Here's ABC's John McWethy.
This is not what UN peacekeeping was supposed to look like. And for missions launched in the name of humanitarian relief, this was not supposed to be the result. But as the world changes, the U.S. and many others are looking to the United Nations to do things that no one else has the stomach or resources to do alone. From Somalia to Bosnia, peacekeeping has undergone explosive growth since the beginning of last year, from 12,000 to nearly 90,000 troops deployed around the world. Troops are now going to places the UN never would have dreamed sending them 3 years ago, often to the middle of civil wars where UN soldiers are getting killed.
I think the UN is way, way overstretched. The fact that it has been asked to do so many things, that the UN is kind of global 911 and too many countries are calling it, is putting into doubt some of the peacekeeping operations that are being created.
The more they tackle, the tougher it gets for the UN to raise money and troops, and the harder it is for the small staff in New York to run this patchwork military. Maurice Baril, a French-Canadian general, is the UN's senior military man.
There's always a different reason why the troops is not ready. It could be administration, the ship are not there, the airplane are not there, or the money is not available.
Even when everything works, critics challenge how deeply the U.S. should get involved.
This is a monster out of control. If other countries want to take their young men and women, put them under United Nations command and have them killed, let them do it. We shouldn't be doing it.
Ambassador Albright says such talk is nonsense.
People talk about the UN as if it were Frankenstein or something. This really is an experiment in the making, and a very exciting one, frankly.
But to make it work will require a bone-crushing overhaul of the way this place does business. That includes new restraints on the UN habit of trying to send troops to every trouble spot around the world. John McWethy, ABC News, the United Nations.
Even as President Clinton was questioning future peacekeeping missions today, Pentagon officials said the U.S. will send about 600 American troops to Haiti as part of a UN mission to restore democracy there. The Americans would help train and modernize the Haitian armed forces and organize major rebuilding projects. In a moment, the other news. A rebel victory shakes the government in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. 20 years after the end of the draft, why are we still paying for the draft board? And the tale of two tenors at the Met.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Tylenol PM.
In the former Soviet Republic of Georgia tonight, a major city has fallen to forces trying to form a breakaway republic of their own. They are called Abkhazis. They have captured the city of Sukhumi on the Georgian coast, which is a major blow to the Georgian president, Eduard Shevardnadze, who Americans knew well when he was the Soviet foreign minister. ABC's Garrick Utley is in Georgia.
The battle for Sukhumi was a major victory for Abkhazi rebels who were supplied and supported by the Russian military. They were fighting for independence from Georgia and to reclaim their capital. In the final bloody push into the city, the Abkhazis laid waste to the government building, which had been occupied by Georgians. It was a bitter defeat for Georgia's president and former Soviet foreign minister, Eduard Shevardnadze. He had put his life at risk by going to Sukhumi to lead the defense. Today, Shevardnadze's one remaining link with the outside world was through this radio telephone in his headquarters in the Georgian capital of Tbilisi. Through his aide and interpreter, he announced he was ready to compromise Georgia's independence and agree to closer ties with Russia if Russian forces would stop the fighting.
I agree to anything, just to save people. But unfortunately, this hell is continuing.
And how much more time does he think he has, the city has?
Difficult to say, but the fighting is in the downtown area now.
Throughout the day in Tbilisi, crowds gathered outside the parliament building, rejecting any concessions Shevardnadze might make to Russia.
We are ready, at least most of the people, to fight for independence. It's better to fight and die than to be somebody's slave.
This evening, Sukhumi is under Abkhazi control, a victory they could not have achieved without Russian support. The fall of Sukhumi is not the end of the crisis here in Georgia. Just about everyone fears a civil war now among Georgians themselves between supporters of Shevardnadze and his opponents, more extreme nationalists who reject any accommodation with Russia. That is the challenge facing Eduard Shevardnadze when and if he is able to return from Sukhumi. Garrick Utley, ABC News, in Tbilisi, Georgia.
As for the power struggle going on in Russia itself, 6 days after Boris Yeltsin ordered the parliament disbanded and called for new elections, Mr. Yeltsin insists he will not compromise with his opponents. ABC's David Ensor, who's been monitoring Yeltsin's political opponents, reports that Mr. Yeltsin has reason to be confident.
This is what the resistance to Boris Yeltsin amounts to. A ragtag platoon training to defend the Russian parliament against the storm these men insist is coming from forces loyal to Yeltsin. They wouldn't have a chance, of course. In fact, a carnival atmosphere usually prevails. Tsarists and communists united only in their distaste for Boris Yeltsin. At night, though, real fear. Or was it just paranoia? Deputies from the outlawed parliament were convinced an attack was imminent at 3 in the morning. They got out their gas masks. Their defenders got out automatic weapons. Nothing happened. Comrade Stalin will lead us to the battlefield, they sing. We will win a glorious victory. But their leader this time is not Stalin, but Rutskoy. Alexander Rutskoy, hero of the Afghan war, competing president of Russia. Now increasingly worried he's been outmaneuvered by Yeltsin.
Rutskoy has lost because he has turned himself from a national hero into a ridiculous figure.
In the half-deserted halls of the parliament, a lonely Rutskoy defender plays his balalaika to keep up his spirits. There is still danger here, but more and more Russians on both sides are simply humiliated by the spectacle their politics have become. David Ensor, ABC News, Moscow.
When we come back, a deadly misreading of medical tests at a hospital in Rhode Island. In Rhode Island tonight, thousands of women are waiting to find out whether somebody's made a terrible mistake in reading their medical test results. The tests are called Pap smears, and when properly read, they can provide early warnings of cervical cancer. Over the past several years, it appears that some of the tests conducted at Newport Hospital were not read properly. Here's ABC's Aaron Brown.
10 months after doctors found a malignant tumor on her cervix, Helene Lewis died. Just 3 weeks before that tumor was found, pathologists at Newport Hospital told her her Pap smear showed no cancer at all. In fact, they told her 4 times over an 8-year period her Pap smears were cancer-free. Now the hospital admits it was wrong. All 4 times. For 8 years, her cancer went untreated because the Pap smears had been misread.
For it to happen once may lead me to believe strongly that it's human error, but for 4 misreadings and misinterpretations to occur, it undoubtedly, in my mind, smacks of, ineptitude.
Which is what concerned public health officials in Rhode Island. When they looked at the hospital's lab, they found that work was so sloppy the lab was shut down. Work was sent to outside labs instead. But fearing unnecessary alarm, they did not inform the public.
I think that we felt that we had protected the public against any ongoing public health threat.
Now 19,000 Pap smears analyzed by the lab will be re-examined. 17 mistakes were found in the first 1,100. And Alma Hubbard, who had 2 Pap smears at Newport, worries they may have misread hers as well.
It makes you wonder, all your tests that you had, are they all normal?
We are really trying to reach out to the women of this community. This has been a devastating experience for them and for the hospital.
State officials now say the lab's problems have been corrected. The lab is open again. But they worry that the old problems extended far beyond misread Pap smears to every other complicated test the lab ran. A decision on a broader investigation is pending. Aaron Brown, ABC News.
Other news today, the Commerce Secretary Ron Brown, through his attorney, confirmed an important element of an ABC News investigation, which we broadcast yesterday. We reported last night that the FBI knows of 3 meetings that Mr. Brown had with a Vietnamese businessman who had ties to the Vietnamese government. The FBI is also investigating claims that Mr. Brown had agreed to accept $700,000 from a representative of the Vietnamese government in return for opening up trade with Vietnam. In a statement today, the Commerce Secretary's office did not deny the meetings took place, but insisted that he never asked for nor received any money from the Vietnamese. A grand jury in Texas has indicted a United States senator on charges of official misconduct. Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison is accused of misusing state employees and facilities during her 2.5 years as Texas State Treasurer. Senator Hutchison told reporters today the indictments are the work of her political opponents.
The Democrats can't get right on the issue, so they're going to character assassination, and I think that's very obvious.
Senator Hutchison calls the charges false and unfair. The director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Stephen Higgins, has resigned. He was responsible for the raid by ATF agents on the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas, earlier this year. In that first raid, 4 agents and about half a dozen cult members were killed. And dozens, as we all know, died later in the disastrous raid and fire that ended the siege altogether. Mr. Higgins resigned just ahead of a Treasury Department report which is expected to be highly critical of his judgment. And there is a new report tonight questioning the safety of the water we drink. This report comes from an environmental group, the Natural Resources Defense Council, and it raises questions about whether your drinking water could be making you sick. Here's ABC's Bettina Gregory.
Regina Krupa got so sick when she drank Milwaukee's contaminated water last April, she had to be hospitalized. Now she doesn't believe the water is safe.
I don't want to take any chances. I don't want those cramps and the diarrhea like I had. No, I couldn't go through that again.
The Centers for Disease Control estimate 940,000 Americans become ill and 900 die every year from contaminated drinking water. The government's own data shows virtually every state has some contaminated water supplies. 43% of water systems violated federal health standards. The new report on the nation's water supplies from the Natural Resources Defense Council charges the Environmental Protection Agency has only investigated a small fraction of the violations.
In fact, the cop is not on the beat, and unfortunately, the law is not being enforced.
We agree that there's a much better job to be done. We've asked for almost $5 billion over 5 years so we can give it to the people who actually run the water systems to make sure they're doing all of the tests they need to do.
And the EPA says more money is needed for state-of-the-art purification systems like this one in Cincinnati, which uses activated charcoal instead of chlorine. Bettina Gregory, ABC News, Washington.
And 2 former Los Angeles police officers were supposed to begin serving their sentences today for the beating of Rodney King, but a federal judge has ruled that Lawrence Powell and Stacey Kuhn may remain free while their lawyers continue to appeal their convictions. On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average gained more than 24 points to close at 35.67, and the trading was moderate. When we come back, your money and the draft.